Welcome to our channel. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Over a period of 5 weeks, the Bernies abducted 5 women aged between 15 and 31. All the victims, except for one, were raped at the couple's residence at 3 Moorehouse Street and subsequently murdered. The sole exception was their final victim, who escaped the day after her abduction and led police back to the Bernie house, thus ending their crime spree. Warning: the following contains images of graphic violence and not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. David John Bernie, February 16, 1951 to October 7, 2005, and Katherine Margaret Bernie, née Harrison, born May 23, 1951, were an Australian couple from Perth who murdered 4 women at their home in 1986, also attempting to murder a 5th. These crimes were referred to in the press as the Moorehouse Murders, after the Bernies' address at 3 Moorehouse Street in Willagee, a suburb of Perth. David Bernie was the oldest of 5 children and grew up in Wattle Grove, a semi-rural suburb of Perth. School friends and church acquaintances remember Bernie's family as having been dysfunctional and subject to frequent rumors involving alcoholism, promiscuity, and incest. The family never had regular meals together, and Bernie's parents did not cook meals for their children. In the early 1960s, Bernie's parents decided to move the family to another Perth suburb, where he eventually met Catherine Harrison through mutual friends. At age 15, he left school to become an apprentice jockey for Eric Parnham at the nearby Ascot racecourse. During his time there, Bernie physically abused the horses and developed a habit of exhibitionism. One night, Bernie, wearing only stockings over his head, broke into the room of an elderly lady where he was boarding and attempted to rape her. By the time he was an adolescent, Bernie had been in and out of prison for several misdemeanors and felonies. As an adult, he became addicted to sex and pornography, and was a paraphiliac. In his early 20s, he married his first wife and had a daughter, Tanya, who was aged 10 at the time of his arrest. Tanya, who has changed her surname since Bernie's capture, has never married and had no children, stating, "I don't want to spawn another David Bernie." In late 1986, at the time of the murders, Bernie was employed at a car wrecker's shop in Willagee, a suburb of Perth. Katherine Birnie was born Catherine Margaret Harrison on May 23, 1951. She was 2 years old when her mother Doreen died giving birth to her brother, who himself died 2 days later. Unable to raise Catherine, her father Harold sent the girl to live with her maternal grandparents. At age 10, a custody dispute resulted in Harold regaining sole custody of Catherine. Catherine met David at age 12 and began a romantic relationship with him 2 years later. Her father pleaded with her on several occasions to leave David, as her involvement with him led to her getting into trouble with police, resulting in her being sent to a youth prison in adolescence. Encouraged by a parole officer, Catherine began working for the McLaughlin family as a housekeeper. She married Donald McLaughlin on her 21st birthday and had 7 children. Their firstborn, a son, was struck and killed by a car in infancy. In 1985, Catherine left her family and resumed her relationship with David. The couple were never legally married, but Catherine changed her surname by deed poll to Bernie. Victims: Mary Nielsen. 22-year-old Mary Nielsen, a psychology student at the University of Western Australia and part-time delicatessen worker, met David at the car wrecker's shop where he worked. David offered to sell Nielsen some cheap tires for her car and subsequently gave her his phone number. Upon visiting Moorehouse Street on October 6, 1986, Nielsen was gagged, chained to a bed, and raped by David while Catherine observed. She was then taken to Gleneagle, near Albany Highway in Bedfordale, where she was raped again and strangled with a nylon cord. David then stabbed her, thinking that it would speed up her decomposition as he read that in a book somewhere. Catherine joined him in burying Nielsen in a shallow grave. She would have received her degree for psychology from the university 1 year after her murder. Susanna Candy. 2 weeks later, Susanna Candy, a 15-year-old high school student from Netherlands, was abducted while hitchhiking along the Sterling Highway in Claremont. Once she entered the Bernie's car, Candy was bound and held at knife point. The Bernies forced her to send letters to her family to assure them that she was all right, then took Candy to Moorehouse Street and subjected her to the same ordeal as Nielsen. Afterward, after an abortive attempt to strangle the girl with the nylon cord, the Bernies forced sleeping pills down her throat. Once they took effect, David put the cord around her neck and told Catherine to prove her undying love for him by murdering the girl herself. Catherine complied and killed Candy while David watched. Candy was buried close to Nielsen's gravesite in Gleneagle. When asked later why she murdered Candy, Catherine said, "Because I wanted to see how strong I was within my inner self. I didn't feel a thing. It was like I expected. I was prepared to follow him to the end of the earth and do anything to see that his desires were satisfied." She was a female. Females hurt and destroy males. Nolene Patterson. On 1 November, 31-year-old Nolene Patterson ran out of fuel on the Canning Highway while on her way home from her job as bar manager at the Nedlands Golf Club. Patterson was picked up by the Bernies and, similar to the first two victims, was forcibly taken to Moorehouse Street and repeatedly raped by David. The Bernies originally decided to murder Patterson that same night, but David kept her prisoner in the house for 3 days amid an apparent emotional attachment to the woman. Catherine quickly became jealous and made an ultimatum: David would have to kill Patterson, or Catherine would kill herself. He immediately forced an overdose of sleeping pills down Patterson's throat and strangled her while she slept. They took her body to Gleneagle, but buried it away from the others. Catherine reportedly got great pleasure from throwing sand on Patterson's face. Denise Brown. On November 5, the Bernies abducted 21-year-old Denise Brown from a bus stop on the Sterling Highway. In the same fashion as the earlier victims, Brown was abducted at knife point and assaulted at Moorehouse Street. The following afternoon, Brown was taken to the Wanneroo Pine Plantation where, in the seclusion of the forest, David raped her in the couple's car while they waited for darkness. After dragging Brown from the car, David raped her again and stabbed her in the neck. Convinced that the girl was dead, they dug a shallow grave and laid her body in it, but Brown sat up in the grave. David then grabbed an axe, struck her twice in the head and buried her again. Kate Moyer. On 9 November, 17-year-old Kate Moyer was abducted at knife point after accepting a ride from the Bernies. David held a knife to her throat and forced her to ring her mother. Moyer told her mother that she had too much to drink and was staying at a friend's house, hoping her mother would realize it was a ruse and called a friend, knowing she was not a drinker. Moyer later stated that she asked them if they intended to kill or rape her, and was informed, "We'll only rape you if you're good." She was forced to dance for the Bernies, and slept in their bed while handcuffed to David. After David went to work on the day following her capture, Catherine went to the front door to carry out a drug deal and forgot to chain Moyer to the bed. Moyer broke the lock of a nearby window and climbed through, but hit her head on concrete. After knocking on various neighbors' doors, she jumped a gate and was attacked by David's dog. She ran into a nearby vacuum cleaner shop, informing the owner that she had been raped. Moyer detailed her ordeal to police. While some of the officers were initially skeptical of her story, 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock believed her from the outset due to the amount of detail she provided, including the Bernies' address and telephone number. The Bernies had given themselves aliases, but Moyer had read David's name on a medicine bottle. Moyer stated the couple had watched the film Rocky on video, and described a drawing she had concealed in the house as proof of her presence. Subsequently, police found the drawing and the video cassette copy of Rocky in the Bernies' VCR. The Bernies were arrested, and during their interviews they gave conflicting information. Catherine denied ever meeting Moyer, while David insisted Moyer had come to their house voluntarily to engage in consensual sex. Detective Sergeant Vince Kadich convinced David to confess and reveal where the previous victims had been buried. Imprisonment. Initially, David was held at the maximum security Fremantle prison, but he was soon moved to solitary confinement to keep him from coming to harm from other prisoners. 3 of the original death row cells were converted for him, and he stayed there until the prison was closed in 1991. The cell can occasionally be viewed on the True Crime Tour, held daily at Fremantle Prison. While incarcerated, the Bernies exchanged more than 2,600 letters, but were not allowed any other form of contact. David was found dead in his cell at Casuarina Prison on October 7, 2005 at 4:30 a.m. WST.19. He was 54 years old. An inquest found that he had hanged himself from an air vent using a length of cord. Various factors led to his suicide. A failure to provide him with his antidepressants had exacerbated his depression, his computer had been confiscated, and he was suspected of sexually assaulting another prisoner. He was described by a former prison officer as a model prisoner who looked after injured animals. Catherine was not allowed to attend his funeral. Catherine is imprisoned in Bandyup Women's Prison. Since being incarcerated, she has worked as a prison librarian and appeared in a prison production of Nonsense. In 2007, her parole application was rejected, and the then Attorney General of Western Australia, Jim McGuinty, said that her release was unlikely while he remained in office. Catherine's case was to be reviewed again in January 2010. However, on March 14, 2009, new Western Australian Attorney General Christian Porter, following requests from the victims' families, determined she would stay in jail for life. This decision makes her the 3rd Australian woman, after Catherine Knight and Patricia Byers, to have her papers marked never to be released. Her appeal of this decision was turned down in March 2010 by Porter. Her 4th bid for parole was declined in 2016. That same year, Kate Moyer began a campaign to end Western Australian laws that automatically put convicts up for parole every 3 years. Moyer has stated Bernie has never even applied for parole. In 2017, Catherine's youngest son, under the alias Peter, called for her execution, stating that his relation to her has resulted in him being assaulted on multiple occasions. He also supports Moyer's campaign.
A special report now on a serial killer's bid for freedom.
She spent almost 3 decades behind bars, but is now facing a chance to return to the streets for the first time since 1986. Liam Bartlett, she is WA's longest-serving female prisoner.
Tim, Emmy, she certainly is. We're talking about Catherine Birnie, the murderer who helped kill 4 Perth women. She was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years, but of course she's gone well beyond that and now has to be considered for release. The detectives who put her behind bars are speaking out tonight only to argue that she's far too cruel to ever step outside prison again. But one of Perth's most respected QCs is arguing it's time.
A judge said she should be eligible for release after 20 years. That's the law. Now, barring any good reason to keep her in, and revenge I don't consider is a good reason, she should be released.
Tom Percy thinks it's time Catherine Birnie, Perth's deadliest woman, is given a chance on the outside, allowed back into the community that she preyed upon in the spring of 1986.
From everything I've heard within the prison system is that she's a very frail old lady who is unlikely to be a problem to anyone at any level.
But the veteran cop who arrested Birnie and saw her spitting on the graves of her victims has other ideas.
I didn't give a damn about the victims. Kathy and David Bernie did not and have never given the victims 1 ounce of thought.
Paul Ferguson was a policeman for 38 years, but what David and Catherine Birnie did still haunt him. The former head of the Macro Task Force says their killing spree was even worse than the Claremont murders.
This one was terrifying, absolutely terrifying, because the victims were just toys, were just instruments.
The victims, 4 young women, lured to their deaths by a deadly duo. Raped, strangled, stabbed and buried in shallow bush graves near Wanneroo and Gleneagles. The Bernies drove around, waiting to spot a single girl to abduct. Stirling Highway was their favourite hunting ground. Girls were enticed to the car by what they thought was a harmless married couple asking for directions. David Bernie would ask Catherine if she had the munchies. If she said no, then the girl went free.
But if she said yes, then she produced a knife that they called Bubba, which was a bone-handled knife. And that was the knife to keep the person in the car, and then later David bound their wrists, and the rest is history.
The rest took place at this house in Willagee. Incredibly, victim number 5, a 16-year-old girl, escaped and ran naked to a nearby shop. The Bernies were sentenced to life on 4 counts of willful murder, to be served concurrently. That meant a 20-year minimum jail term. But Justice Wallace said then, "In my opinion, you should not be released from prison ever."
Get in there, you dog!
David Bernie hanged himself in his cell in 2005. And by 2007, Katherine Bernie had served her minimum. Now a new report is being prepared for Attorney General Michael Mission to consider by early February.
Almost 30 years after her killing spree, Catherine Birnie has become a librarian, dealing out books to the bandy-up inmates. She's said to be quiet, self-assured, but enjoys the notoriety of being the prison's gruesome star.
Are we a society that is based on revenge? And keeping her in really is just bastardry. It's just an exercise in pure revenge and hatred.
This is different. This person is different. Society hasn't seen, certainly in Western Australia, society hasn't seen someone of the nature of Kathy Bernie.
Kathy Bernie, you forfeit your right to walk out that door, because those poor girls didn't deserve it. Didn't deserve it.
Liam Bartlett, 9 News.